The world runs on petroleum. But finding and developing the resources to meet the world demand for oil and gas has always presented challenges to energy companies. In the early days, the decision of where to drill for oil or gas was based largely on surface geology and hunches. Energy companies would look at the curves and contours of the Earth's surface and guess as to what might be beneath. The process was expensive and intrusive, and the results were unpredictable, often with a severe impact on the environment. But the process was evolving. Over the years, this best guess system of deciding where to drill was being replaced with science in the form of seismic surveying technology. Seismic surveying is a process that uses low-frequency sound waves to see beneath the surface of the Earth. An energy source, either a vibrator truck or a buried charge of dynamite, is used to send these sound waves deep into the Earth. Each time these waves encounter a change in the rock layers, part of the wave is reflected back to the surface, where an array of listening devices records the returning signal. The recorded information is then processed to develop a kind of three-dimensional map of the subsurface. Energy companies use this information to decide where to drill by identifying subsurface rock formations that are likely to contain trapped oil or gas.
It's not all that different from, say, a medical analogy where a doctor takes an X-ray or an MRI of someone to see inside their body. Well, we collect seismic data to see inside the Earth. And when we do that, we take the guesswork, a lot of the guesswork out of our energy development.
According to the Independent Petroleum Association of America, the number of dry wells has gone from an industry average of over 70% during the 80s to less than 50% today, primarily due to the use of 3D seismic surveys.
Every area is different, but where we're working in the Paradox Basin, if we drilled without 3D seismic, we'd drill with about a 25% success rate. But with 3D seismic, we'll drill with about a 75% success rate, so much higher success rate.
Seismic surveys have saved oil companies millions of dollars. But what kind of impact does seismic surveying techniques have on the environment? To find some answers, we traveled to the western United States, to Utah, home of the 2002 Winter Olympics and some of the most spectacular natural landscapes in the world. Here, some people believe that seismic surveying represents a major threat to the environment.
The damage that's being caused out there in the landscape really has not so much to do with how they're getting the data as just the fact that they're driving across the landscape with huge vehicles and just crushing everything inside.
Like I said before, we don't really want to see the most special landscapes that are there for all Americans on public lands to enjoy. To be developed, and seismic is one of the things that opens that door for development down the road. Starts that process of moving the status of that land from undisturbed to developed to more developed, you know.
Some environmental groups here are strongly opposed to seismic surveying on these lands. One of the largest and most active of these groups is the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. SUA declined our requests for an interview, but in a written response to our request, SUA Conservation Director Heidi McIntosh said, "We're not trying to bring oil development to a halt. We're just trying to maintain some balance by preserving some of the most scenic places in the world from development that's probably speculative at best and won't add significantly to U.S. oil supplies." According to their website and press releases, SUA opposes seismic surveying on publicly owned land because seismic surveys can cause irreparable harm to the environment, that surveying techniques can permanently scar the landscape, threaten wildlife and fragile desert soils, and spoil the pristine character of these scenic and undeveloped public lands. At the heart of SUA's and other groups' concerns are the techniques used by seismic survey companies to create the energy source. This is a thumper truck. It provides the energy source for a survey by dropping a large heavy metal plate against the earth, sending a shock wave into the ground. Thumper trucks can leave deep, lasting scars on the landscape. But these trucks were phased out of the seismic industry over 20 years ago.
We no longer use thumper trucks. Thumper trucks are an obsolete seismic energy source that hasn't been used for 20 years.
Some reporters and some environmentalists are just not informed, and they don't realize that thumper truck is an incorrect term. Some environmentalists know the difference, but still choose to use the term thumper truck.
Thumper trucks were replaced with vibro-sized trucks. These 60,000-pound vehicles transmit energy into the earth by pressing a steel plate against the surface and vibrating through a range of frequencies to generate the seismic signal. These vehicles are considered by environmental groups like SUA to be the most destructive part of the survey process. According to their website, thumper trucks ravage soil, causing such ecological damage that it could take as many as 300 years for the desert to recover. Author and SUA Board of Directors member Terry Tempest Williams visited a seismic survey and described what she saw in an article published in the New York Times.
Up close, the thumper trucks creeping along the desert, following a path of fluorescent pink ribbons, looked like gigantic insects, gnawing and clawing, articulating right and left as they balanced themselves across the rugged terrain. Fumes from hydraulic fluid stung our eyes, and the noise threatened to blow out human eardrums. At the designated stop, each truck in the convoy lowered a steel plate onto the desert, clamped tight, applied some 64,000 pounds of pressure against the sand, and then sent a jolt of seismic waves below to record density. The ground went into a seizure. Sand flew and smoke obscured the horizon. When the steel plate lifted, the once supple red sand had turned to concrete. Terry Tempest Williams.
But other people who have witnessed seismic surveying firsthand consider accounts like this to be inaccurate, malicious, even dishonest.
Fumes of hydraulic fluid.
A lot of the information they're putting out on that is far from the truth. You know, I've watched a lot of it, and most of the stuff they say is not true.
In the position I'm in, and with as many people as I see and talk to during a week, if there were problems with this process having taken place in our community, I promise you I would have heard about it.
These people use this inflammatory language as an attempt to try to get to people that are uninformed. You know, that's been their tactic. It obviously has worked. We see politicians doing the same thing. So, you know, negative campaigning, it seems to be that that's the route that the environmentalists are most successful. It's working for them, so why quit something that's working?
Other environmentalists who've witnessed seismic surveying up close found that the operation wasn't quite what they expected.
I was actually surprised that I wasn't revolted. It was, certainly the trucks were large, and I mean, I still have concerns about seismic operations, but it did focus my concerns in a small way.
I was impressed that I think the crews did exactly what they were supposed to do, and they followed the BLM's stipulations and mitigations, and they seemed to be real conscientious about the weather, because we did have pretty wet weather during the project, and they were shutting down whenever it got a little bit wet.
And often, you know, people after they see the operation are kind of have the, you know, the attitude of is that it? You know, where's the rest? It's pretty anticlimactic for them based on what they've heard in the paper and some of the sensationalism that they hear before they actually ever see the operation.
Vibro-sized trucks aren't the only energy source seismic companies use when conducting a survey. In areas where vibro-sized trucks aren't able to work, surveyors use a buried explosive charge to generate the acoustic energy. The survey company drills a small hole ranging anywhere from 10 to over 80 feet deep, usually using a tracked vehicle equipped with a small drilling rig that is driven from shot point to shot point. In areas that a drilling vehicle can't get to, the survey crew uses a portable drilling system moved from point to point by helicopter.
The heliportable is very environmentally sensitive in the sense that it's low impact. It's picked from the helicopter down to the spot, so it just touches the ground and drills a hole, and it's back out of there.
To detonate one of these charges, a member of the survey crew connects a special radio control unit to the buried shot point. It is then fired remotely. The underground explosion is barely noticeable at the surface. Afterwards, the crew repairs the area and moves on to the next shot. Since the subsurface is made up of different types of rock layers, the cuttings from the drill can cause a patch of discolored earth that in some cases can remain for several years. But environmental concerns go beyond the potential damage during the survey. Environmentalists point out that the paths created during a seismic survey can become unofficial roads that visitors use to take vehicles into remote locations.
And, you know, they say they're mitigating and stuff, but they're not, from my experience out there looking at the site, they've just made cleared a new path through pinyon juniper landscape and cryptobiotic crust, and it's just going to be another place that people in four-wheel drives are going to go out and follow, and, you know, it's going to stay another open wound in the landscape, just like all the previous ones.
The traffic prevents the paths from ever recovering, and the easy access to these isolated areas places sensitive environments and important archaeological sites at risk.
Our sites in this area range from almost imperceptible to very large and spectacular. At the large and spectacular end of the spectrum, we have cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde National Park. We have large villages out in the open mesa top country. And at the smaller end of the spectrum, we might have only a few artifacts that represent where somebody sat and cleaned a game animal or was collecting some sort of edible vegetation, such as nuts or berries or whatever. And the small sites maybe are not as equally important as the large sites, but they all contain some sort of valuable information about how the prehistoric people in this area lived.
In our project area, people were very concerned about the archaeological resources, and they were worried that we were going to damage and destroy cultural resources. They didn't understand that long before our vehicles come into the field, we have archaeologists go out and map where all the arc sites are, and then we have to avoid all those cultural resources. We have our vehicles move around those arc sites.
There really isn't any downside in terms of the cultural resources. There's only positive results in that we're learning more and more every day about where people were living and what they were doing and when they were here.
People are still looking at this as back in the old days when they used to just, essentially they did terrorize the country sites, you know, in the old days, but nowadays they're so environmental friendly that I can't even really, I have a hard time seeing a problem with any of it they do.
This survey line is over 15 years old and is still clearly visible because the seismic company conducting the survey used bulldozers to clear the path. But the techniques used by seismic companies today are considered by most people to be much more environmentally friendly. This line is less than 18 months old.
That's one thing about seismic work. I've not only been out in the flat rock, but like back up in Wyoming, and you generally don't see any evidence of you know, what they've been out there and what's been going on out there. And I think, like I said, I know that seismic work is very low impact.
I was very impressed. There are not a lot of people on the crews. You know, there aren't people running around all over. It's very low impact. What we saw with the 3D situation was even the buggy trails into the holes didn't create a lot of ground disturbance.
I think the problem is that most people don't follow up. If they were to go back to our projects 2 or 3 years later, 4 years later, I think without a map to identify where our routes were, I think it would be very difficult for anybody to locate them.
Seismic surveying is also considered to be more environmentally friendly than other exploration alternatives.
Ultimately, 3D seismic is environmentally beneficial because with the 3D seismic data, we'll avoid the drilling of unnecessary wells. And wells are the things that really leave the long-term environmental impacts because you have to build roads and you have well pads and equipment out there.
In the long run, in the bigger picture, it's actually beneficial because we have less dry holes. We focus on the areas where the resource really is. So we minimize the impact by using good geophysical data and following good science. But that message never gets carried forward.
Seismic is more and more becoming an important tool in oil and gas exploration. We have a lot of concerns about surface disturbance on our lands. We try to be responsible in the way we use the lands. We believe in multiple use, being able to develop minerals and surface. And so we don't want a lot of surface disturbance.
I wouldn't consider it a threat at all. In fact, you know, you might even consider it being something that might even help us manage some of the other resources. If we're able to identify where the oil and gas is at, maybe we can concentrate our efforts there and not be exploring and drilling in areas that really don't have the potential. So I think there's some advantage there.
Yeah, again, it's saving them money. They're not spending all that money at drilling dry wells. You know, obviously, that's a very expensive thing to do. So it's a lot cheaper for them to go out and drive across the landscape, causing considerably more damage than any of those drill pads did by driving a grid pattern with these huge vehicles. So yeah, again, it's another thing. It's convenient for the oil exploration company, but it's not really being very considerate of the landscape.
The task of sorting out the perceived and actual impact of surveying on public lands usually falls on the government. In the U.S., the Bureau of Land Management, part of the Department of the Interior, is responsible for evaluating and approving or rejecting seismic survey plans.
Well, the National Environmental Policy Act is a very procedural law. It requires us, for any federal undertaking or federal action, anything that we approve, in other words, where we have a discretionary decision to make, that we have to analyze the environmental impacts and disclose them to the public in a public process, and to develop mitigation to make certain that whatever the proposed activity is minimizes the environmental impacts while still allowing the purpose and need of the activity to go forward.
Conservation groups like SUA accuse the BLM of rushing through permit requests, of ignoring the potential impact on the environment, and favoring the interests of the energy industry.
The leading bureaucrats in the BLM have pretty much had the mandate laid down from the president that you will make this, streamline this process and make it easier for the oil companies or whatever mineral exploration companies to go out there and get whatever they want. Well, you know, now it's down to organizations like the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance to fight with lawsuits to protect areas that are being that should have been protected that are not being protected because the bureaucrats are being bullied by the administration.
The need to go to a lawsuit is symptomatic of a breakdown in the process. I mean, from our perspective, the BLM ignored everything we said all the way through. I mean, we submitted written comments and we talked to them and got lots of other people sending comments, and they pretty much just ignored everything we said. So it was sort of a way, the only way for us to really get their attention was to smack them upside the head with a 2x4.
The BLM, along with the energy industry, disagrees.
Well, it's hard to put anything on the fast track in this agency, I'll guarantee you that. Because everything takes a lot of time. Each time you go through the environmental review on like a major project like we've been going through with WesternGeco and Veritas, it's more like anywhere from a half a year to a year to prepare the environmental assessments and go through the review process, the public review process. On the last environmental assessment that I worked on for Veritas, we had almost 30,000 comments that had to be gone through and answered.
You know, I've been involved in operating on Indian and federal and state and private land in the state of Utah since 1983, 20 years almost. And I can't remember anything ever being fast-tracked.
To say we wait till the last minute, or the BLM waits to the last minute and fast-tracks everything, that's just absolutely not true.
In fact, in most cases right now, I would say it typically takes at least 4 to 6 months to obtain a permit before the crew ever starts the process of recording data. And in some cases, if it's an area that is in any way controversial, it may take a year or more. And that's very common now. So the idea of our projects being permitted overnight and that we are allowed to just go out into the project area and do whatever we please is very aggravating to me, because that is not true. And anyone who knows anything about the process knows that.
Communities are more likely to favor seismic surveying because of the impact a seismic crew has on the local economy.
The economic benefit to the community is terrific as it spreads out. And in a little town like this, that kind of money is, you know, I mean, it's just a tremendous impact to us.
We just don't see things in the same light that SUA sees them in. We think seismic activity, mineral exploration is vital to our survival. And I know that SUA and some of the environmental groups feel like this is their private playground to come out and listen to the rivers talk to them, listen to the quiet environment, and if they had their way, I'm sure they would get rid of all noise, all vehicle activity, everything that had any kind of a sound or a visual impact on government lands. But we as private landowners, we have open arms for this kind of activity.
For trust lands, oil and gas is the biggest part of our revenue. We are charged with finding the highest and best use for the lands that we are managing on behalf of the beneficiaries. I mean, it's a very important source of revenue for the schools, and to deny us the ability to develop it would be very sad.
But the economic impact on a local economy is temporary. Once a survey is finished, the seismic company moves on.
There's a two-edged sword. If you're entirely dependent on one industry and you're dependent on world commodity prices, then you can get, you live well while prices are high, and then you go in the tank when prices drop.
Although the diversity of issues surrounding oil and gas exploration can vary from one environment to another, most of the people involved express the same basic concerns: that accurate information and open communication are essential.
And I think if people would look into that a little more, and instead of trying to shut everything down, but to look into the facts of what precedes this and what happens afterwards, they might change their minds.
Well, I'm sure there is a middle ground somewhere, and we're nowhere near it. I mean, just, the fact that these giant trucks are being pushed as environmentally sensitive, it's ludicrous.
The energy industry and the seismic contractors do have to do a better job educating the public, the general public, and describing our operations to them, because what gets printed up in the newspapers is, most of the time, is just incorrect.
Just having more dialogue at the front end of a process like this is a good thing, as a rule of thumb. And oftentimes there's a polarization that really contributes, between environmental groups and industry that exists, that is really unnecessary.